She had spent a lifetime folding her hopes into careful plans. A dress sketched in margins of notebooks, a small garden wedding beside the willow, vows she had memorized on long walks. And then in a single hospital-lit night, the life she knew was taken away. People said they were sorry, then stepped back. Friends who stopped answering messages, in-laws who spoke in hushed sentences, and the man she had promised herself to who found reasons to be elsewhere. The title of her story could have been a headline on 1,000 feeds. Poor bride rejected for being paralyzed until a single dad did the unthinkable. But headlines only ever tell the end. What happened in between, the quiet months of courage and the single moment of choice, is the part that changes you. What you are about to see is not a spectacle of pity or a sudden tidy rescue. It is a slow-burning surrender to what still matters. A break in the pattern of shame and silence, and a decision that shocked a small town and healed a woman who had been learning how to love the parts of herself that were left. Stay with me, because the next scene will make you question everything you assumed about bravery, luck, and the human heart. And there is one small impossible choice in the middle of it that no one saw coming. If you believe in kindness and second chances, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to Hopeline Stories. Every click helps stories like Mara's find the eyes they deserve. Marivos had once believed that life was a ledger of fairness. You worked hard, you loved fiercely, and the world balanced itself out. Before the accident, she was a landscape architect with a laugh that could split a room. She wore her hair in a messy bun, watercolor stains on her palms, and the kind of optimism that made strangers confide in her over coffee. She and Rowan Price had been engaged for 2 years, planning a wedding that felt like a promise more than a party. Then a winter storm, a slick road, and a single wrong swerve turned an ordinary Tuesday into a geometry of metal and glass. The doctors used words that felt like knives: spinal cord injury, incomplete paralysis, months of therapy, and the future she had pencil lead in with Rowan's handwriting at the corner of the page blurred into smudges. He waited at the hospital for a day, then a week, then one more week. The way the world unmade around Mara was not dramatic. It was a series of small irritations that became a roar. Missed calls, postponed visits, excuses layered in silk. By the time Mara left the hospital in a wheelchair, Rowan's presence felt like a photograph in a frame that had been turned to the wall. For the first months, Mara battled 2 enemies at once: her own body and the social gravity that pulls away from anything that looks broken. Insurance would cover some things, but not the deep ache of being treated like something fragile to be hidden. Invitations came with asterisks: "We're so sorry," followed by tentative, awkward silence. The bridal shop that had once fit her in a gown of ivory lace now offered her a dressing room at the back, as if privacy equaled dignity. People who once loved her spoke in the language of caretakers rather than equals. There were consolation notes, and then there were the messages that never came. It was in these quiet betrayals that Mara learned the cruel arithmetic of abandonment. The more you need people, the more some of them find reasons to be absent. Into this thinning of attendance and warmth stepped Mateo Cruz, a name that became a soft punctuation in her days. He was not a knight in the way hero stories promise. He was a single father whose son clung to his leg in the grocery aisle and who worked 2 jobs to carve a future for his little boy. Mara had met Mateo in a rehabilitation center group, the kind of awkward therapy circle where people are forced to face what broke them and what might mend. He spoke little at first, smiling with his eyes rather than his mouth, and he juggled the logistics of life like a man who had learned to stretch himself thin without losing his center. His son, Luca, a freckled, quick-footed child who loved building cities out of cardboard boxes, sometimes came to the afternoons they spent at the community garden, bringing Mara a paper plane or a drawing that looked suspiciously like a spaceship. Mateo's kindness was practical, fixing the squeak on her wheelchair, carrying grocery bags up a flight of stairs, bringing thermoses of soup when winter returned. It was not patronizing or cloying. It was steady, deliberate, and sometimes painfully ordinary. It taught Mara that love need not be an explosion of grand gestures. Sometimes it is the patient accumulation of small, unflashy acts. Mara fought a private battle with shame. She watched her reflection and had to relearn how to love a body that no longer obeyed. In public, eyes sometimes darted away, uncertain where to rest. And Mara felt the weight of that discomfort as if she were a soft thing in a world that preferred hard lines. She had planned a wedding once, and the memory of that planning sat like half-healed glass in her chest, sharp, beautiful, and dangerous to touch. The village gossip did not help. People love stories where suffering leads to either saintship or a dramatic fall, and no one seemed to want the mess in between. There were nights when Mara would scroll through messages from Rowan, saving them like relics, and nights when she would cry until the edges of the room blurred, and Luca's small hand would pat her knee, sensing without understanding that the world was heavy. The day Mara decided she would not let the accident steal her wedding, even if she had to redefine what that wedding meant, was the day she started making lists again. Not lists for seeding her flowers, but lists of things that made her feel like herself. The willow tree in the community garden, the band that once played in her apartment for a friend's birthday, the small bakery down the road that made lemon tarts the size of a palm. Friends who remained, Tessa, a marathoner whose legs moved like clockwork, and a Makeka who ran a floral studio and understood the language of color, began to stitch a ceremony that was not about making her whole again, but about honoring who she already was. Rowan refused to attend and sent a text that said he couldn't be there and hoped she understood. The word understand in that context felt like a knife polished neatly and put away. Mara felt the blade then set it down. She would have a wedding because she'd always loved the idea of saying yes to joy, even if the answer looked different from what she'd once imagined. On the morning of the small ceremony, under the willow, the garden smelled of cut grass and lemon zest. Chairs were arranged in a half moon. Petals formed a soft path, and strings of lanterns waited like fireflies for night. Some faces were missing. Rowan's absence left a hollow that people murmured about but could not fill. Yet more had come than she expected, a constellation of those who had stayed, who had chosen to believe in Mara beyond her accident. Still, there were empty seats that hinted at the cost of loss. The small gathering moved as if in a shared breath, toward a pivot they did not yet understand. Matteo arrived late as he always did, Luca dragging behind him with a cardboard crown askew on his head. He did not need to be the hero of a story. He was simply present, steady as an anchor, restless as someone who had learned that life would not wait for permission. Throughout the ceremony, he sat quietly, his hand often finding Mara's in a gesture that grew from friendship into companionship in the most unremarkable significant way. She watched him as if through a film, seeing him differently now, not as the man who fixed things, but as a man who had stayed when others had left. His face carried the maps of his life, small ridges of worry, laugh lines earned in a dozen small battles, and a gaze that had learned how to witness without trying to fix everything at once. The unthinkable moment came not with fanfare, but with an ordinary shift in attention, a gust, a wine glass tipping, a child's laughter turning everyone toward a new focus. Matteo rose, not dramatically, but with a quiet certainty, the kind of movement that rippled outward like a stone dropped into still water. He walked toward Mara, and in that walk there was more than motion. There was intention. He did not speak in grandiose phrases because he had learned early that words could be hollow. He simply reached for Mara's hand, a gesture that both belonged to them and defied the script the town had written. He offered himself not as a savior, not as a pitying substitute, but as a companion willing to commit to the everyday labor of loving someone who had already known abandonment. The gesture was electric, but not in a way that stunned. It warmed. People shifted in their seats, a rustle of surprise moving like wind through the leaves. What Matteo did next is the kind of choice that lives in the part of the world that prefers to stay hidden. He proposed not out of obligation or sympathy, but because he had watched Mara rebuild herself and wanted to continue that work alongside her. It was not a spectacle. It was a man looking at a woman he admired and saying in the plain language of action that he would choose her every day. To some it read as radical. To those who knew them it read as inevitable. The villagers who had once whispered now found their voices muted by the humility of the moment. Mara's chest ached not from loss, not from pity, but from a slow, fierce joy that had nowhere safe to go. She accepted not because she needed to be saved, but because she had found someone who saw her complexity and wanted to be part of it. The vows they crafted afterward were not about miraculous healing. They were about promise, to show up, to keep learning, and to build a life where Luca's cardboard cities could stand beside Mara's blueprinted gardens. After that day, the town learned a new grammar for kindness. People who had once sorted the world into neat categories, able and not able, brave and broken, discovered that life refuses to sit in boxes. The presence of a child in the house brought tantrums and laughter. And a renewed sense of purpose. Matteo juggled his jobs with a new urgency that felt less like burden and more like investment. Mara designed a small accessible play garden where children of all abilities could roll and climb and imagine. Her work once sidelined by pity thrummed again. Clients sought her out for projects that married sensitivity and beauty. She designed inclusive spaces that felt intimate rather than institutional. Her art, now informed by the angles of her wheelchair and the lived experience of adaptation, found a voice that older commissions had never required. It was not a sudden triumph or an eraser of pain. It was gradual, a coming into shape of a life that made room for scars and laughter at the same time. Still, there were echoes of the past that required tending. Rowan's decision to leave did not erase his presence in Mara's history, and she had to grieve the loss of the life she thought she'd planned. Grief did not behave like a single storm, but like weather that sometimes returned in soft, insistent drops. There were days when Mara's therapy appointments felt like small declarations of war against a body that forgot itself. There were nights when loneliness woke her more acutely than any physical pain. But in those spaces, Matteo and Luca offered a different kind of solace. Company at the sink while they washed dishes, laughter over burnt toast, the small domestic rituals that make up the scaffolding of a life. They celebrated Mara's triumphs with honesty, and held the hard days without offering hollow comforts. Their love was not about erasing the past, but about widening the table so that past and future could sit at once. The community's reaction was slow and uneven. Some people took comfort in the tidy narrative, the rescuer, the rescued, but most of Mara's neighbors began to appreciate the more complicated truth. Love, when it is chosen, looks less like a fairy tale and more like a series of daily dependable decisions. Neighbors who once kept their distance started to stop by with pots of soup. Not to fix anything but to share in life's unpredictability. Mara's mother, who had at first wavered between fierce advocacy and sobering pragmatism, learned to let go of the urge to shelter and instead joined Mara in the messy business of living. The town's conversations shifted from pity to curiosity and then to a slow, steady admiration for the life that had been rebuilt with honest hands. Months after the wedding under the willow, when the garden had become a place where children with missing limbs and parents with scarred hands came to test ramps and read beneath oaks, Mara stood by the window and watched Luca run with a paper plane that had been scrolled with impossible galaxies. Matteo, with the exactness of someone who measures the world in small mercies, stacked crates for a new planter box they were building for the community. Mara thought of the long nights that had once stretched ahead like a desert, and felt grateful that loneliness had been met with company. She looked at Matteo and saw, not a man who had done the unthinkable, but a person who had chosen the ordinary heroism of showing up. It was an unglamorous courage, and yet it changed the town quietly, stubbornly, like roots breaking pavement. If this story touched you, if Mara's journey from rejection to a life rebuilt with tenderness stirred something inside you, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to Hopeline Stories. Your engagement helps bring more stories of second chances and ordinary courage to light. If you're moved, consider sharing this video with someone who needs to know that being left behind does not mean you are unlovable. And that kindness often shows up dressed in the practical clothes of a single parent, a neighbor, or a friend. Before we close, please leave a comment below. Tell us which small act of kindness in the story stayed with you the most. Or share your own second chance story so others can find hope in yours. Stories like Mara are made of tiny human pieces. A thermos of soup, a hand on a wheelchair, a pair of hands stacking a planter. If you felt something when Matteo reached for Mara's hand, if you felt the echo of your own resilience or the warmth of a stranger's compassion, write it down. Your words could be the lifeline someone else needs. In the years that followed, Mara and Matteo's marriage was not a magazine spread, but a life of intentional choices. The slow routine of morning coffee brewed too strong. Luca's cardboard cities becoming a neighborhood legend. Mara's gardens blooming where wheelchair ramps met. Flower beds, and the town learning to redefine normal. Rowan remained a chapter, not the whole book. And Mara learned to carry both loss and love in her hands without dropping either. The unthinkable had not been a single dramatic rescue, but the quieter revolution of one person deciding again and again to remain. That is where true healing lived, in the everyday courage to show up, to listen, and to build with what you have. If this story warmed you, please support more stories like this by liking and subscribing to Hopeline Stories. And don't forget to comment below with your thoughts and any stories of kindness you've witnessed.